Good afternoon, good evening, good night to all our attendees. Welcome to the MAC series, The Power of Museums. My name is Shani Roper. I am Curator of the University of the West Indies Museum, as well as Secretary of Museums Association of the Caribbean, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we begin our introductions, just some household matters. For those of us who are joining via Zoom, we're providing French interpretation in French. So we're asking that you go to the bottom of your Zoom application, click interpretation, and go to French. In addition, if you have any questions during the course of our event, please put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as we go along. For our community joining us on Facebook, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Our moderators will put the question in Zoom so that we can have our panelists this evening engage. Now that we've covered that, our preliminary, our rules for the show this afternoon rather, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our main speaker today is Dr. Csilla Ariese, who is a museologist specializing in decolonization and community engagement. She recently worked as a postdoctoral researcher to study how Amsterdam Museum deals with its colonial past. Her PhD, The Social Museum in the Caribbean, focused on community engagement as a result of visits to 195 museums across the region. We're here today to discuss her latest book, which was co-authored with Magdalena Robleska, which I may not be pronouncing properly, which brings together a varied collection of practices from around the world with thought-provoking essays. Our speakers who will be reviewing Cilla's book today would be our Sumaya Kassim, who is a writer, editor, and researcher. She writes fiction, art, criticism, and essays which hold museums to account. Her essay, The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized, is widely cited. She's also a prose editor for Middle Ground magazine, a publication for creatives of mixed heritage, and is currently writing a long-form poem examining the entanglement between colonialism and the environment, several film scripts, and a novel. Our second speaker would be Kevin Farmer, and he is Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. From 2010 to 2011, he was Assistant Lecturer in Archaeology in the Department of History at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad. He is co-editor of the publication Plantation to Nation, Caribbean Museums and National Identity. His research interests includes the creation of cultural identity in post-colonial states, the role of museums in national development, and the management and curation of archaeological resources. So let's move forward. We want to keep this short and tight, and so I'll ask our main speaker for this evening to proceed. Csilla.
Hi, thank you for that lovely introduction. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night to everyone who's here. Welcome to my living room. And I will start immediately by sharing my slideshow with you to just jump into it. As Shani already mentioned, a little quick background that we will start with, just to give you a bit of an idea why I was so interested in the Caribbean. I did my PhD, as Shani mentioned, on museums across the Caribbean, and specifically on community engagement and grassroots heritage initiatives. So this was the publication that came out of that, which is also available open access. And during my time working in the Caribbean, I was also on the board of the Museums Association of the Caribbean. So I will just quickly jump forward, as Shani did such an excellent job at already covering my background. And what we will really be focusing on today is this publication, Practicing Decoloniality in Museums, a guide with global examples, which, as Shani also mentioned, was written together with my colleague Magdalena Wroblewska and is available also online open access. And really what we're going to just quickly go through this publication so we can set it up for the discussion with my co-panelists, Kevin and Sumaya. And as it's open access, I just encourage you, if you think it might be interesting, relevant to you, to your students, to your colleagues, to just have a look at it. Just quickly why we wrote this book. We were looking ourselves for kind of toolkits and examples on what you can do to decolonize the museum, because there's really so much going on, but we were struggling to really find these accessible, practical guides with just lots of examples that you can sort of pick and choose from. So that's also a bit who we wrote this book for, people working in museums, but also people studying museums and students studying museums. If you're ever thinking, what can I do if I want to decolonize, you can look through this book and hopefully find some inspiration that works for any kind of setting you might be in. So the main conceptual framework, the way Magdalena and I designed this publication, is around 6 aims of decolonization. And during the rest of my talk, I will just go through these one by one. But just to explain this framework, we started with this idea that we want to make sure this is not a typology with strict criteria or categories, that something fits into one thing and not the other, but really this idea of a framework that somehow we can organize our thoughts about decolonization in a bit of a structured way. But we wanted to make sure that we designed a framework that works for all types of museums. So say not just ethnographic museums or historical museums, but really any kind of museums, any kind of their activities, whether it's an exhibition or a program or an online event, and whether this is, you know, a single person owned house museum or a large institution, that basically there's something in here for everyone. And so that's really the concept with which we wrote this book. And the way in which we designed also these 6 aims of decolonization is that each of them has an active verb in it. So it really implies the action that's needed to reach that aim of decolonization. One thing that I should note in all the examples that we have throughout the book is that the way we've written it is really beyond sort of the directly colonial exhibitions or objects, because we feel that practicing decoloniality is really relevant for any museum, any context, any object, whether this was a museum that was opened yesterday with brand new collections or something that has its roots in a colonial past. We really think that these aims of decolonization are relevant everywhere as part of this drive to kind of decolonize the world a little bit. So the examples are divided thematically. And also, I think it's very important for me to say here is that we really try to get this global collection of examples on, you know, different types of museums and activities and scales. And we were really driven to not find, you know, best practices, because this is a book that just collects practices to provide inspiration, rather than, you know, kind of a lecturing, this is well done, this is not so well done, in whatever way we think about it, because then we start to get into a whole different problem of who decides what is success, what is not successful, and so on. So rather than evaluating these examples, we really provide an analysis of them. So I'll just jump straight into the first aim. So as I mentioned, there's these 6 aims of decolonization, and that's also how the book is structured into 6 chapters, 1 per aim. And as it will become clear as we go through them, a lot of these examples that we've ended up putting under 1 aim could work under multiple aims, because decolonization is really such a broad effort oftentimes. It's not just pigeonholed into one direction or with one aim. So the first chapter and the first aim that we discuss is creating visibility. And really this is, creating visibility, say, for histories, for communities, for peoples, anything that we feel has not had the visibility that it needs historically. Or say, finding a community that's actually has a very strong voice in their own area, but isn't represented in the museum, for instance. And so also every chapter, really, we begin with a bit of an essay to discuss what is the issue with creating visibility and how can this be approached, before we then delve into the examples. And for each chapter, we have 4 examples that we discuss in more detail. But because in our research, we found so many relevant examples, actually, we always have further examples and further readings for the reader to look into. And the main thing we felt with creating visibility is that the decision to make something visible or invisible is always related to power. So whether we think that, something is the norm or not the norm, or something deserves the attention to be represented in the museum, this is always a matter of power. And so rethinking visibility is also a manner of rethinking power and power structures in the museum. And this example I'm showing here is from the Caribbean. I've tried to pick most of my examples from the Caribbean tonight for our audience. This is from Grenada, the Belmont Estate, which is also one that we describe in the book. And this is a place where, you can also see from the image, there's this kind of ruinous mill, colonial mill, but really the focus of this estate is on the landscape and taking care of that landscape. And so it's a deliberate decision to focus on that plantation estate, on the landscape, rather than some of the colonial architecture. Then the second example, or the second aim of decolonization, is increasing inclusivity, which we've taken to mean the inclusion of non-museum voices, actors, or decisions into the workings of the museum. And as you will see, a lot of these aims of decolonization, sharing power and these sorts of things are kind of at the root of decolonization in general. And so this example from Liberty Hall in Jamaica is a mosaic that was created over several summers during a summer school program with children. And Liberty Hall is focusing on Marcus Garvey and Marcus Garvey's legacy in the Caribbean. And so one of the things I really admire about this museum is how they also really work on uplifting the communities in the present by doing, say, literature courses for adults, or computer skills to find jobs or write on your CV, and also these summer school programs for children. Then the third example is decentering, which we describe as essentially an act of shifting the norm. And the way we see this is that sometimes it takes really deliberate thought to get out of what we see as norm or normal. So kind of that automatic gut response way in which we do things or see things, it often takes extra effort to step out of that. Or extra help from others who have other perspectives who can really help this decentering. And the example I have here is from Memento Park or Statue Park in Hungary, where these Soviet-era colonist statues have been taken out of the town squares and positions, powerful positions in which they were really meant to impose this communist way of thought to everyone passing by. And they're kind of grouped together in this statue park where they really take on a completely different power, and they take on a completely different role. And this is a very literal sort of act of decentering, about taking objects out of a space and putting them into a different space. Then we have championing empathy. I think this is one that is often not as deliberately thought about in efforts to decolonize. but really empathy is at the root of understanding other people's, other perspectives, other ways of life, other living beings. And it's something that I think museums still have a long way to go in really considering empathy, not just in the labels they write, but also in the experiences they offer. And this is one of the examples also from the book from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, with their contemplative court and this space, this large space for contemplation, a space to deal with emotions. Because, you know, the more museums are dealing with these contentious topics and difficult subject matters, the more it's also important to allow space for people to process these emotions, to understand what's going through them. You know, as the more museums are becoming less of these temples of knowledge and more of these spaces for contestation, for working on identity, for all of these matters, we also really need to empathetically take care of our visitors. And part of this chapter is also say about terminology, about language, about there's an example in there also from the Caribbean, which has to do with language and you know, the relevance of, say, Papiamento and Creole languages, and you know, having museums create exhibitions in those languages, for instance. Then the next aim is improving transparency. The way we've talked about this in the book is really an openness and willingness to tell more than simple stories and sharing contestations and debates. So really creating that transparency into the museum as an institution, showing that, you know, it's not just simple how an exhibition is made to create one story, but that there's also, say, debates going on that those working in museums are very familiar with, but that the visitors might not be aware of, and to really show a willingness to show that behind the screens difficulty. And this example is one of our further examples, so it's not described as detailed in the book, but so I'll just mention it here. It was an exhibition coming out of the Traces project called Dead Images, and it centered on all these human remains that had been kept in museums, in university collections, for instance. And the whole exhibition was about the debate, you know, do we or do we not show human remains? Do we keep them? Do we repatriate them, rebury them? All of these discussions. And in the end, it was up to the visitor whether they wanted to see the image of these human remains or chose not to see the image of the human remains. So it gave really that power to the visitor, but also led them in to this debate that really, you know, museums are also struggling with a lot themselves. And then my final example, embracing vulnerability, which I think ties in a little to the previous one, which is really giving yourself, and as an institution, giving yourself the permission to be vulnerable, to expose weaknesses, doubts, work in progress, to, you know, accept that you might have an exhibition, but maybe that shouldn't be rounded off at the very start, but change as visitors give feedback, or embrace the vulnerability that, you know, also the museum doesn't have all the answers to everything. And the picture I'm sharing here is of Kevin Farmer, who will be speaking later, with Sabir Nakuda, who published a book on the history of the East Indian community in Barbados. And this was one of the things that led me also to work together with Kevin a couple of years ago on really this community wanting to create an exhibition together with the Barbados Museum. And then the museum having to really work with a community with a set idea, but then the museum also having their own ideas of what good community engagement is. And maybe I won't get into this too far because I'm sure Kevin might now touch upon it now that I've mentioned it. So yeah, this was really the final aim I just wanted to bring up, just to give you an insight into the structure of this book. Yeah, just to end off, you're very welcome to contact me if anyone has questions after all of this. But we will also have questions later. And so now I'll hand over to Shani for the next speaker.
All right, so I'll invite Sumaya to respond. Sumaya.
Hi, Csilla. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really interesting. And yeah, a lot of food for thought. I've kind of just prepared a short just a talk to kind of this, because actually the project that I was a part of is in Csilla and Magdalena's book. So I just thought I would kind of talk a tiny bit about that, and I want to talk about the exhibition a tiny bit, one of the objects in there, and also how my ideas have changed over the last few years. And thank you so much also for the organisers for inviting me as well. And just so you're aware, I'm fasting, so I'm a little bit, it's like the last hour until we break fast, so forgive me for my low energy. Anyway, so a few years ago, I wrote an essay called "The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized," which is into sort of referencing Chilla's book. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm actually real. It's very strange. Which has documented my experience co-curating an exhibition called "The Past Is Now: Birmingham and Empire." There were 6 co-curators that were involved in the curating of this exhibition. I was invited on board by Shani Roper, who is a really talented textile designer, and her and another a curator called Ilia Hasina, who is from the Caribbean, were the organisers behind the project. And they were the ones who got in touch with Sarah Wadjid, who was a prominent person in the museum. And that was what got the project off the ground. And the kind of thinking behind The Past Is Now is it showed all the ways in which Birmingham, the UK's second city, is tied to empire. So Birmingham was Empire's factory. It produced its gun, its metalwork, and also our perspective from the exhibition is the idea that Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution could not have happened without colonialism and without the exploitation of enslaved people and the exploitation of natural resources as well. So The Past Is Now was all about highlighting how past lives, how the past lives in the present. In so many ways. I mean, it structures our entire reality. And one of the objects which we presented was a very large mahogany grandfather clock. And why did we have this clock there? It was kind of an attractive object, but it's kind of the kind of thing that you would kind of walk past. It's kind of thing that's in a stately home, and you wouldn't really pay it any attention. But mahogany is obviously a wood that grows in the Caribbean. The trees once covered Jamaica, and it became a favourite wood in the colonial period in England. And mahogany furniture was seen as a kind of luxury. And so the colonialists then deforested Jamaica, and this there's a variety of reasons why this was useful to them, and this had a dramatic knock-on effect because the roots of these trees held the soil, the earth together. So the earthquakes didn't cause the kind of devastation that it does today, i.e. landslides. Another knock-on effect from these colonial endeavours is the microclimate that exists today that then it sort of impacts worldwide the climate. So the exploitation of people then, but also today, and the exploitation of natural resources then and also today continues to make our world less habitable and likely uninhabitable in the near future. And this is just one of the ways that we try to show the hidden interconnections between historical colonialism and the colonial reality today. So at the time, so this is a couple of years ago, at the time, it was seen as a kind of pioneering exhibition and maybe even a bit radical. But for us, for the co-curators, we didn't think of it as a kind of radical statement, because for us, we were just simply telling the facts. And the reason for this is because all of us, we all come from different backgrounds, right? None of us are white, and we have different memories than your average white British citizen. I would argue that Britain is a house ruled by silence. It is a house full of secrets. When we went to school, we learned a version of history that is hugely redacted, right? We were taught about kings and queens, and we were taught about World War I, and kind of implicitly, we were taught about a kind of natural order. So implicitly and sometimes explicitly, we were told that white men left Europe and civilized the world, and that Britain is great because of hard work. This is despite the fact that Britain's empire once spanned 3/4 of the globe and at its peak had 800 million citizens, which is why when the first Windrush generation arrived in England, they were holding British passports. Our street names and our buildings, our beauty standards can all be traced back to the colonial period. But because we are not taught about colonialism, we're not taught about enslavement, people wander around with this false understanding of history, and it shows. So I would argue that this then, this kind of silence, willful ignorance, if you will, it means that we kind of still live in this kind of a colonial reality. I would argue colonialism has not ended. And in a sense, we still live in the imagination of white men and their fantasies. And in this house of silence, museums are a bit like basements. Museums are some of the only places that these stories are touched upon, and they're often not great at it. Obviously, in Csilla and Magdalena's book, I think what you see is that museums are trying and think through, both through practice and through ideas, how we can think through our colonial realities. But it often still museums do reflect those fantasies and myths. But yeah, so as I said, that exhibition was a couple of years ago now, and I wrote The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized several years ago. And it is interesting because as I was listening to Csilla talk, I was thinking a lot about how my thinking has changed. Because at the time I thought of decolonizing as a kind of intellectual tool or a practical tool which bridges the gaps in people's imaginations and remedies the forgetfulness or the willful ignorance that a lot of people have. And in some ways it's quite an optimistic essay, although I'm sure that's arguable. But I'm increasingly thinking about how the word decolonize has moved through our culture as a kind of rallying cry to being exploited by cultural institutions as a consumable product. And the term is widely used within the academy, and it's online, it's kind of almost a meme, where you can slap decolonize on anything and sell it or get funding for your projects. And it's given me like important questions to think about, like, can we use the same word decolonize for the restitution of an object in one context, but then can we use that same word in the context of the restitution of land in another context? And people, you get the case where people might desire greater diversity in media, for instance, or greater desire for diversity in the workforce, and they may call that a decolonial goal. But I've been struggling with this. I don't have answers to this, but I've been struggling to think through this, because I think part of it is like, is a decolonial project measurable? Like, is a way to measure such a thing? And places like universities, they run on measuring things, right? So many would argue, as the authors of Decolonizing is Not a Metaphor do, that decolonizing should only really be about the restitution of land, reparations. So is it that depending where you are, decolonizing is different, or should we stop and consider whether decolonizing should only be about land and resources? So increasingly, I believe the challenge is how we listen to each other carefully, and also to consider how our dreams of the future differ, because our realities differ and our experiences of history differ. But what hasn't changed is my belief that colonial institutions tell us something important about the tenacity of power structures. Trying to change a colonial institution whilst we live under colonial regimes, which a museum is a kind of metaphor of that if you think about it, and under exploitative capitalist systems is impossible. But I would suggest that that impossibility is the place we must begin. Yeah, and that's me done.
Thank you, Sumaya. Okay, so Kevin, your response.
Hi, I'm hoping. Oh, sorry. Right. Hi. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and you can see my slide projection. My response is going to be very much centered in the Caribbean. And to state upfront, I think the Caribbean museums have been involved in various stages of decoloniality since independence in the 1960s. But by saying that, one must then recognize how that then throws up a lot of different issues, simply because when we speak about the Caribbean, we're not speaking just about the English-speaking Caribbean. There are at least 4 different colonial languages which are spoken, and then dozens of dialects. So whether we're speaking about the English, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and the American, we're then dealing with countries and colonies in various stages of proto and pre-independence. And I dare say in the case of Barbados, now dealing with one looking at what it is to be an island in a post-republic phase, whatever that is. And it throws up a lot of interesting questions, not only about who we are, but how has that post-colonial experience shaped the national identity that we sought to create? Because that national identity in and of itself has a particular lens of colonization, even though wrapped in a decolonial banner. And I say that because for the most part, when I speak about the English-speaking Caribbean, I'm speaking about a largely African descendant population which sought to create an identity framed around how do they deal with the trauma of enslavement and colonization in forging a new path. But in doing so, how do they themselves then marginalize people of Asian, indigenous, mixed race, descent, ethnicities within their spaces? So in a way, our post-independence creation of a national self has in itself colonized and marginalized others. And how then do we seek to redress that imbalance in coming to terms with the idea of decoloniality? And it's going to be traumatic, and it has to be, because what you are coming to grips with, and I'll borrow what is in Cilla's book, is embracing those 6 pillars and utilizing them as a type of multifocal, multi-narrative toolkit that we can begin to use to unpack who and what we are and the varying aspects of our multiple national stories across time and space, that allows us to deconstruct, decodify, decentralize, and reprioritize the multiple narratives that define who we are as a people, recognizing that we're not going to get it wrong. But once we engage in some serious reflexive introspection, that we can somehow allow our heritage spaces and museums to become the focal point in which those contested narratives and those issues around trauma and reconciliation can be centered and be amplified and be given space to actually have voice. And that to me is extremely important when we speak about decoloniality in the region. But also then to re-engage with larger, when I say larger, outside of the region museums, wherever they are, whether it's Europe, North, Central America, Asia, to begin to examine, so what do you have in your museum that is representative of my culture? And what are the multiple ways in which we view the same objects? And in that, begin to privilege our intangible, begin to privilege our oral history. That becomes a key starting point, because if decoloniality is around power, and power is about language, and language are about words, then how are the words that we're choosing to describe either inhibiting and or enabling others, including ourselves? So I'm quite pleased that Csilla and the other author sought to do it thematically and not necessarily to come up with the answers, but to pose the multiple questions. And I dare say, in one of them, I'll disagree a little bit. Landscape is colonization. The landscape in this region is very much colonial. The way in which we seek to decolonize it is to understand how it has been created and demarcated, because it is not benign. My favorite phrase is, for those of you who like Star Trek, the whole concept about terraforming a planet. Well, the Caribbean has been completely terraformed. The estates of the 16th century are still called estates today. The roads that we drive and walk and ride on are colonial routes created to move exploitative goods and exploited people to and from spaces of production. We still use them today. How do we begin to center and understand that and to decolonize it? Which means that we need to fully embrace and understand the space that we walk and how it has been created in order to unpack the trauma and come to some form of reconciliation. So I think I'll stop there, because I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I just want to thank Sumaya and Kevin and Csilla, because these are the important issues that we have to unpack when we're thinking about the context in which decolonization is taking place, and is the term applicable across space and time? I mean, this is something that, you know, I've been thinking about. A lot of us in the Caribbean have been thinking about, and some of our colleagues think it's not applicable. So I think this is a great space for us to begin the discussion. And so, Csilla, I want you to kind of start, I mean, because you looked at these examples, you and your co-author identified some themes, some possible trajectories, which of course, as you've said, are not set in stone, but really what are the limitations? And also, what is the limitation of the actual phrasing decolonial, right? So yeah. I really wanted to start with that question that Sumaya has asked us to wrestle with.
Yeah, thank you both for Sumaya and Kevin for your responses. And it's a struggle. Honestly, well, just to be the full, transparent, vulnerable thing here, this whole publication started before I was hired in this project, and someone had promised that there would be a book at the end on best practices for decolonizing the museum. And so, I get this job and I'm told that at the end I'm going to have to produce this. And I think, I don't really feel comfortable doing that at all. So we already kind of veered away from the best practices in any case to do a publication that we thought actually would be useful and viable. But even then, beginning with the brief of writing a book on decolonizing the museum, it's a huge task. And to an extent, I do agree with Sumaya that, it's kind of an impossible situation to decolonize the museum as such a colonial institution and a colonial concept. But I mean, the way I read your essay at the time also, Sumaya, is that there's still there's still hope there. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, right? So even though we're in kind of an impossible situation, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And that's also kind of the approach that we had with the book, that there's so much going on with people doing their, their honest hard work to at least try, that we should bundle these examples together as a resource for other people who are trying. And this is also why we veered away from evaluation. And I saw one of the questions in the Q&A also about, what are the metrics for measuring change? And my co-author Magdalena and I talked about this a lot, when we still had this best practices idea at the start. How would we even go about measuring change? Because for absolutely every example in the book, we would need separate metrics, because, every decolonial project or idea or action starts with a goal, or it should. That's at least, how we wrote the book as well, with a guide to how you want to set up your own project. You need to start with a goal. And then if you want to measure success, you have to measure it as opposed to that goal. That would be the most obvious thing to do, but that still wouldn't even mean that it's successful, depending on, say, what other people would have envisioned as a goal. So it's so difficult to even think about measuring change, that instead we really veered away from doing that. And well, Sumaya, correct me if I'm wrong, in from that space of impossibility, still trying to see what we can do with it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, because what happens when we do talk about what decolonizing means is the word hope this is the word that comes up, oh, that's hopeless, or is it hopeless? But when I say that I think that decolonizing is impossible, or that the museum, I'm not necessarily, that's not an ending statement. Just because you can't do it doesn't mean that you stop. So during your presentation, I wrote down the words incremental, granular, the power of small actions, and I think about the word impossibility in a slightly different way, which is, it's not possible, but then we still continue. Isn't that what it is to be human? Like, sometimes I think to myself, we never talk about decolonizing the family. I mean, I'm sure some people do, but we never do. Why? Because if those who know, but like, you have a really difficult family and you're dealing with trauma and intergenerational trauma and all of that. We're not talking, we understand what we mean when we say it's an impossible situation. But why is that different when we apply it to colonial institutions? It's the exact same thing. Intergenerational trauma, you've got imperfect human beings coming together and trying to do an impossible thing. That doesn't mean that healing doesn't occur. That doesn't mean good things don't come out of it. But we recognize, and it's important to recognize, it's impossible because it's impossible in loads of different ways, but on the front of people coming together and trying to create something, trying to enlighten people. Are we trying to educate people? Are we trying to change people's minds? Who are we trying to do that to? There's so many different aspects to it. And then there's also the aspect of, are we talking over other people and other communities worldwide? Because obviously we're connected with people worldwide now in a huge way. Like we're visibly seeing people have these conversations. Sometimes it feels like, should we be using the word decolonize when some people are talking about their water being literally poisoned? So so when I say impossibility, I'm kind of a bit of a provocation there, but I mean it philosophically, right? Like, I mean it practically, philosophically, I mean it in lots of different ways, but I don't mean it as a hopeless statement by any means. Yeah.
I just want to jump in here because that question is also directed at Kevin as well, about the impossible project of decolonization in the colonial and former colonial settings. And so I want to take this opportunity also to combine about 3 different questions that are really about, how does decolonization happen in the Caribbean museum context, right? So I'm going to ask Kevin to respond to Sumaya, but then to veer off into that section and then have Csilla also jump in. But also I think one of the useful ways, because what we're really having is a conversation. I think also we can think about what it means when you're Caribbean in the international context as well. Sumaya, so if you feel like you can offer 2 cents there, please feel free to jump in. So I'm going to back out a little bit and have you guys kind of play with that idea of decolonization in the museum context, because that question has popped up on Facebook as well as in the Q&A here.
No, you dropped the mic in that, Shani, thanks. I don't think it's impossible. I think what it requires is a real step back and a willingness to unpack and unlearn. And I'm sorry my PowerPoint didn't work properly, but I came across a wonderful quote by C.L.R. James when he was asked whether the Caribbean person should forget about Shakespeare and Rembrandt. And he said, no. He says you can't, because we have been forged and taught within a Western paradigm of education. But in so doing, it means that in understanding that, we then have the ability to recognize its limitations and its pitfalls, because it's only in understanding it can you begin to unpack it. And I think the unpacking there is where our impossible becomes possible. And I use the metaphor of independence. The movement towards independence in the Caribbean is an experiment. It's an experiment in multiple levels of government and understanding. And at the same time, it is also an experiment in trying to homogenize an identity that is a myth. But it allows us to take a step back and deal with the multiple groups and the multiple narratives and the multiple people, and allow the space for their story to come to the fore. And it's in allowing those stories to come to the fore that internally in the Caribbean, we can begin the process of decolonizing our museums. And of course, it's very ironic that the majority of our museums exist in colonial buildings. So we first have to unpack what the building itself is, then deal with the objects and the various ways in which we've gone about collecting them, recognizing that many of them were collected through theft. Let's be honest about that. Many of them are collected as instruments of torture or collected as materiality created out of oppression, and begin to tell those multiple stories. And I think that we are placed in a very unique position because of where we are and how we were formed to be at the forefront of that wider discussion around decoloniality. And then when we take that within the space of the larger international museums, we come to those questions, I'm going to biasly say, more informed and with more incisive questions. And I'll use this example. I was shown a fantastic landscape of an English estate house in Tate Gallery recently. I looked at it and smiled. And I said, well, you know, I know that the picture is presented as a particular artistic school showing the benefit of capitalism on the English environment. I said, but take a step back. Look at who owned the estate. The estate was owned by someone who had plantations in the Caribbean. Therefore, are you not then seeing the plantation landscape being imposed on an English rural setting? And you then begin to recognize that our gaze has an extremely strong resonance, and then to reinterpret their gaze. So it isn't a case of Europe imprinting on the colonies, but this is a case of the colonies imprinting on Europe and having that discussion and understanding that this is a imperfect two-way street of exchange, which we can seek to deconstruct through examining the power structure. And just want to end it there for now. Yeah.
Well, 100% agree with that. Like, obviously I cannot speak to the Caribbean context directly, but what I will say is that my colleague and friend Nathaniel Coleman often describes how Birmingham is a plantation. You know, it has the plantation. They collapse the, colonialism in a sense collapse distance, right? Like when we look at these colonial centers, are we looking at a center or are we looking at a periphery? And I owe my debt to Caribbean philosophers and thinkers for, like C.L.R. James, for thinking these things through, and the fact that, of course, a lot of Caribbean intellectuals came to London and England and formed their, you know, that exchange is there, and definitely that is the case. So yeah, just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and just to continue on that, two-way exchange is obviously still happening. And I know this is something that Kevin and I have also talked about previously, in terms of, you know, if you think about decolonizing Caribbean museums and the fact that, you know, there's very few opportunities within the Caribbean to study, say, museum studies, and that a lot of people working in museums in the Caribbean have had their abroad European or American formal education in an academic setting and then return. So this whole exchange, I think this adds this extra complication, layer to really decolonizing within the Caribbean, because you have obviously your own mindset from home, and then you have this colonial academic mindset on top. And as much as, you know, the academic world is trying to decolonize its curriculum and so on, I don't think that's in any way really been successful yet. Just to throw that in there, I also wanted to respond to one of the Q&A questions by Michelle, who asks how Caribbean museums can execute decolonization more effectively when money streams are following colonial structures. And this is also one of the examples in our book that we have, has to do with the Museum of British Civilization, which was funded entirely by the Chinese. And so this adds this whole, I mean, even if there's this massive bag of money that comes towards the creation of a museum, so-called no strings attached, you know, there's always going to be some strings attached. Do you want to talk about this, Kevin?
a little bit, because I think what I find interesting in this, and you're absolutely right, and I'm going to make a point I made maybe a week ago in a seminar that I got invited to by Professor Hoffman for her archaeology students. We're talking about decolonization, and we're talking about funding. Access to funding is still very much unbalanced. So European, in this case, European institutions have great access to cash research. We in the Caribbean have the collections. There's need for that greater collaboration around the discussions of decoloniality and understanding materiality, and really following it from creation to the multiple ways in which it is used in order to tease out those multiple stories. And I think that is really important. So I will again say that the Nexus project was in a way an exemplar of what should be happening throughout the region. Because in most cases, a lot of that research is in a way continuing the exploitative nature of colonization. It is one way. There's need for it to be broadened and to be reciprocal. Whether you want to say reciprocity is reparations, that's fine, because part of the whole concept of decoloniality has to center around the whole idea of reparations. It'd be nice to have a project that begins to take a really hard look at what's in European museums and what's in European museums that originate from the Caribbean. So we know academically that part of the core collection of Hans Sloane, which started the British Museum, is centered in the Caribbean. Both in terms of the material, both in terms of discussions around ethnobotany. But there has never been that exhibition between Caribbean museums and the British Museum to explore, well, what does that really mean? And how does that tie into thought processes around knowledge and privilege? And how does that ethnobotanical and ethnographic knowledge then used to reinforce particular systems? So that's needed, and it's needed in a serious way. The other issue here is a more practical issue. The Caribbean is under threat by climate change. And it's under threat by climate change by those countries who have greater resources than we do, or climate change footprint is small, but in terms of facing the brunt of climate change, we're gonna stick our hands up for 80 or 90%. So in concepts around decoloniality, where are those expressions of interest around resilience, both that are tangible and intangible are safeguarded, so that we have a better understanding of our contribution to humanity on a purely humanist platform. And these are some of those discussions that we really need to have. And I'll throw this one out in terms of empire. Students of post-imperial history will tell you that time and space are not divided. Time and space are very much interlocked. So Caribbean sugar ended up in Scandinavia to sweeten East Indian tea, which comes across 2 oceans back to Europe and the Caribbean, is intertwined. And in some cases, the same families are owning both sides of the exchange. And in that, the exchange of ideas and materiality. I mean, everyone likes to point to the blockwork prints of Japan, but no one wishes to have that discussion about the movement of semi-precious jewels from India to the Caribbean, or the impact of Madras in how Caribbean women are dressed and then sexualized in the 19th century. But these are discussions that we need to have. And at the same time, how the exploitation of palm oil curtails agricultural development in West Africa, which has then a multiplying effect on the rest of us. So there are all of these questions to be teased out. And if we're really going to talk about a pan-global look at what is colonization, perhaps that's the place that we need to start in exploring the imperial and understand the ways in which it intertwines in what is here. And the other example of that is, I'm trying to remember his name, I'm going to forget it. The protector of the indigenous people in Australia is sent from Australia to the Caribbean. He becomes a protector of the Indians in Ghana. So we talk about exchange of ideas during that colonial period. How does that then impact on what happens over here based on what he learned in the Pacific? So we need to tear down the artificial silos of geography and space and time, and to look at this in truly a more holistic way. To borrow Foucault's whole theory about mentality and totality, both in history and materiality, is what we really need to do if we're going to have a true discussion about the decolonial, both within the spaces where colonization occurred and in the spaces which sought to colonize.
Okay, I'm going to jump back in here. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
One thing, I just wanted to share that I linked in the chat 2 links. Colleagues of mine, Mariana Francoso and Amy Stricker, worked on these publications in this interactive map also of European collection, or sorry, opposite, Caribbean objects held in European museums. Yeah, so that's a bit of an interactive map if anyone is interested, as finding out what is where as a first, thing. Go ahead,
Absolutely. Shani. Okay, so we are actually running out of time. Okay, and we still have quite a bit of questions. And I tell you, I'm so sad about this because this is poignant. These are things that we're actually working on, how to deconstruct our spaces in very thoughtful ways. So I'm going to try and pair some stuff together, right? For those of you who cannot stay to listen to the rest of it, this session is being recorded and will be posted to the Museums Association of the Caribbean YouTube page. So you'll be able to jump back in and watch it. And of course, Cislla's email is also available for any additional questions that you may have. Okay, so I'm going to try and combine a few questions here. So there are some questions that we have that are about the kind of practical means going forward. So for example, There's a question about renaming of roads, public spaces, and houses as a way of claiming new reality. There is another question, sorry, I'm jumping from multiple spaces. There's another question from Gregory, which is really about, almost there, give me 1 second, right. He's from the Auger from Bronze Museum in Haiti, and he has a question about merging symbolism of historical facts to inclusive discourse, right? In the process of decoloniality. And the third one I'm going to put with this is, do we believe that institutions of the colonial period, which continue to exist, need to be decommissioned to allow for decolonization? So, so while the questions may have been addressed to Kevin, at some level, they're also very kind of broad questions. Oh, and I can add one more from the Dutch Caribbean to that. From Aruba, how can we all play a role? So how can we as practitioners, for example, as NGOs, in this case Aruba, play a role in the practice of decoloniality? We won't be able to answer all of them, but I'm hoping that with 1 or 2 minutes, you can just kind of answer a part, if you can, right? And that may be Kevin and Csilla. And then last one, because I know I'm piling them on. This one is for Sumaya, which is, what methods did you use to reconcile the colonial narrative, not only in terms of decolonization of content, but to empower when in the inclusion or revisiting of historical events? So I feel like those are all practical questions. So I'm going to ask you 1 minute each to kind of respond. And I'm going to go check them off on our Q&A, and then we'll have closing remarks.
All right, let me try to collapse the decommissioning with the symbolism. I don't think that they need to be decommissioned. I think what needs to seriously happen is a real rethink of what they are and what their remit is. And I'll use the Barbados Museum as an example of a work in progress. It started as a colonial museum whose remit really was to find things Barbadian, but to frame it through a lens that the empire is better, that has sought to revisit and revise that to be a museum that then explored what it means to be Barbadian in a post-independence context. And it's now entering a third phase of what it means to be a museum in the age of republicanism that seeks to be both inclusive and be a focal point where all narratives within the nation state can be discussed and addressed. And in so doing, be inclusive. And in the inclusivity, allow for diversity at the same time, which means that one has to be willing to be a focal space in which multiple contested narratives can be heard. You're not necessarily trying to arrive at an answer, but you're providing the safe space in which the multiple narratives of your people can be told, and be told in an authentic way that privileges the margins. And when you're finished, there are in fact no margins. That might be aspirational, but I think it is necessary if we're really going to explore to the fullest extent what it means to be decolonial, or more importantly, what it truly means to be a museum that is reflective of the national character of its people. Good, that's me. Minute.
Sumaya, go ahead.
Yeah, just my 1 minute starting now. So the thing is, when it comes to practicalities, the thing is, it has to be many different things. Perhaps decommissioning is one thing that can happen with in some cases, but like I have this vision, okay, where we need to call the British Museum, okay, the Temple of Whiteness, okay, and I've written an essay about this, so that's coming out in a couple of months, and it's called Museums are Temples of Whiteness, yeah. And that is what I think that those types of museums should be called. That there are those types of museums. That's what they are. They've got bodies in there for some reason. They've got stolen objects, which are loot. Yeah. They've got sacred objects. What are they doing there? That is a temple. What is it a temple to? White people. There we go. So that's what some museums are there for, right? That's their object. That's their job. But then we've got museums like the ones that Csilla and Kevin have been talking about, that they're there for a slightly different purpose. Like sometimes they could be called history centers, or you know, they have slightly different names. But what they're trying to do is create a different type of space and a place to imagine the future slightly differently using history, right? That's slightly different, isn't it? Not always different, but sometimes different. And I think that the idea of, you know, Csilla talked about decentering, also defamiliarizing, questioning, you know, our perspectives. You know, if you're straight, you know, if there are queer perspectives, that's going to challenge you in some ways, or and in so many different ways, thinking about all diversity in all its different ways, right? And you know, what it is that we imagine, you know, for our future, like what a society, what we want it to look like. But again, it's what is the we, and like how can we listen carefully and not speak over each other and try and create that type of environment. And I've seen it happen where you're in a room and that hosting event, that building, that circumstance, that community creates that environment. But that's something that is, again, it's the incremental, it's the granular, it takes time. And what's scary is that we are in a state of emergency, like in different parts of the world, we are in a state of emergency. And therefore that's the tension for me, that these things take time and takes relationship building, but we don't have that time. So that's my minute done, I think. So yeah.
All right, I'll try to wrap a few of the questions together. Yeah, I'm really vibing with what Sumaya said about this granularity, you know, and I think that's also really the idea of our book, is that, you know, recognizing that base state of impossibility, we accept that, we move on, and we do what we can. And so this is what I would say to the NGO in Aruba: go through the book, see what you can do that works for your museum, for your audiences, at your scale, with your funding. There's always something that you can do. And, you know, you never know what bigger impact that will actually have on your community and on your visitors and on the people around you. Like it takes hard work, but there's always something that we can do. And I think that's also a way, in response to another question, that's also what we can do to make sure that this, you know, conversation about decolonization is more than a trend, is more than what Sumaya mentioned, like just slapping a sticker on a project and just being like, okay, we've ticked that, you know, tokenistic box and we can move on. So I think it requires hard work, but we can do it, and we can all find ways in which we can contribute to trying to make things happen, to creating these repairs, to ensure that there's healing. And there was one question specifically about the contemplative court at the National Museum of the African American History and Culture, and whether that's a chapel space or a therapy space. I think the way that space is created, also conceptually with the architecture of water as like this healing, moving element, it could be, you know, what a person needs at that point. And that's also what has happened in that space, whether people sit there in silence, whether they cry, whether they sing, whether they have conversations. It's just, I would just call it a space for emotion. And as you can have emotion in a chapel space, in a therapy space, that's also highly personal. And I think that, you know, those are also indeed the kind of museums that I see as having an important social role to play, are the museums that create space for this. And just to tie back to what Sumaya said about, you know, the Temple of Whiteness, and I will definitely read that as soon as it's out. But also one of the examples in the book is on those places, say Indigenous-led community centers that are deliberately not calling themselves museums. So this is also one of the examples in the book, just to finish it off with the terminology.
Okay, all right, wow. This was such a great, I got chills listening to you guys. It was such a great discussion, and I wish we could spend longer talking about it, because there's really so much to talk about. And you know, it tells us that like what was said in your opening statements, colonization is ongoing, and so therefore the act of the decolonial is small steps to hinder the ongoing process of colonialization, and it requires us to do a lot of self-reflection in our spaces, even those of us who are engaged in decolonial practice. You know, there are a lot of comments coming in. People thoroughly enjoyed this. So, closing comments. In this case, just 30 seconds each. Before you start, I want to say to our attendees, because you're slowly all leaving, that this is the first in the Power of the Museums series that MAC will be offering for the rest of the year. And we will be engaging topics and speakers from the French, Spanish, English, and Dutch Caribbean. And, you know, if you have a key topic that you think is interesting, please feel free to send it to us. We're hoping to have discussions about negritude in the Spanish and French context and things like that, just really so that we in our own spaces are having a conversation about decolonization that's not completely shaped by the discussion that's happening in Europe and the US, because, you know, they're fighting their own battles. Okay, so 30 seconds. And then we'll, Sumaya, Kevin, and then Csilla, since your book is the star of the show too. So Sumaya, Kevin, and then Csilla, and then I will tell everybody goodbye. So go ahead.
Oh man, I thought that last comment was my last. I feel like I'm blown. What I will say is I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with you all, and I found it incredibly educational. And I think this issue of what you just said, Shani, this idea of it's granular small against the ongoing tide, I think that is absolutely crucial. And I think that also what you said, which is that own communities should have their own conversations, absolutely right as well. So that's what I'll leave it at.
Yeah, like Sumaya, I thought I was done. On a practical note, I think these conversations should continue. I think we should somehow, over the course of the next couple of months, have a working group that begins to explore two things: where are collections to be found in the Caribbean and outside of the Caribbean, and then to work out panels, essays, exhibitions that explores it in a really decolonial way across empire and across languages. Because I will leave you with this: my navel string is buried here is a term that is spoken in every single Caribbean language, regardless of its metropolitan creation and in multiple dialects. So that for me is a focal point that says we're all connected, and we now need to explore the materiality and the intangible in exploring the decolonial. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say thank you for all of my co-conversationalists. I mean, as always, you know, you give me more to think about, and it's so thought-provoking. And I remember sitting in the car with Kevin in the Caribbean, and we go on long drives, and every time I just have to sit and think about everything that, you know, now I've completely changed my mind about everything. And I feel like that thanks to both of you. And thank you also to everyone in the chat, because truly you've really contributed tremendously to this conversation. That's why we've had such a long going session, and it's been incredibly valuable to me also to see your questions, your thoughts, what you're grappling with. And I really hope to stay in conversation with you all. I recognize quite a few of you in the chat, but I hope we've made new friends that we can continue working with. So thank you so much.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody who joined us today and participated. This event would not have been successful. Well, I think we could have all had a conversation among ourselves, but this event is actually more successful because our audience engaged us and asked us questions that really required us to think about what we were saying. I wish you all a good evening, and please stay tuned to the MAC Facebook page for more on our Power of Museum series. I want to thank all of our presenters. It really was just a brilliant, brilliant discussion. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Shani, Csilla, Sumaya. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Shani, for moderating. Thank you. Good night, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Bye.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.